Great, thank you. So in terms of the agenda today, we're going to do a quick round of introductions from SOS-UK and climate outreach, and then we'll move on to talking about the research and our key findings. And then the second half of the webinar is devoted to understanding a bit more about how we can use the insights from the segmentation research on a kind of holistic level from climate outreach. And then also we're going to talk a bit about how the seven segments apply to some of the work that we're doing at SOS-UK. And then at the end of the session, there'll be a chance for any questions. You can use the Q&A function to ask your questions throughout the webinar though, but we'll kind of pick up on the things that you're asking at the end of the presentations. So in terms of SOS-UK, as some of you may know, we are a student-led education charity that focuses on sustainability. Through our work, we want to see more students leading on and learning for sustainability, an education system repurposed around the climate emergency and ecological crisis, and sustainability that's more inclusive for everyone. In the session today, you'll hear from myself, Rachel. I'm Head of Research and Impact, but also colleagues from across SOS-UK who deliver our research and engagement work. So Swetha Guruprasad is our Research Coordinator, Joanna Romanovic is our Director of Engagement, and Emma Lewins is our Senior Project Manager for Engagement. Now I'm going to hand over to Louisa Mello, who's going to introduce you to climate outreach.
Yeah, hello. Also from me, my name is Louisa Mello, and I'm a researcher at Climate Outreach. Climate Outreach is a team of about 30 social scientists and climate comms experts, and we work on deepening and broadening public engagement on climate change. We're based in Oxford, and many of our projects are focused on the UK, but we also run projects in other countries. So we've worked in Germany, in Australia, in Egypt, and Alberta, Canada, for example. And in terms of what we practically do, so we carry out social science research projects, we provide advice to other organizations and run trainings and bespoke workshops. We also build partnerships and support networks, and we advocate about the importance of public engagement to decision makers. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Louisa. So we're just going to now get into the detail of the presentation and look a bit more on the research we did into student attitudes and beliefs on climate change. So first of all, what motivated our research? Well, we kind of really wanted to understand a bit more about the different perspectives on climate change amongst the student population in the UK. So how their values and beliefs and attitudes varied, recognising that it's not kind of a homogenous group, the student population, although there is often a tendency to kind of treat them as such. We wanted to use this improved understanding to work on our communications and engagement activities with students, but also to share our learning with our networks. So you as listeners to this webinar, and we really hope that you find the report and our webinar today useful in supporting your work on climate change. So Louisa's just going to introduce you to Britain Talks Climate. So I'll hand over to Louisa.
Yeah, so Britain Talks Climate, which you can see a screenshot of here, is an evidence-based toolkit that Climate Outreach designed to support any organization that wants to engage the British public on climate change. It is based on national research that was carried out in 2020 by Climate Outreach, More in Common, the European Climate Foundation, and YouGov. And this research used the More in Common core beliefs model, which helped us to identify notable differences in terms of the identities and beliefs between different groups or different segments of the British population. And based on this, we identified 7 segments in Britain that were also used in this study by SOS-UK. So although Climate Outreach was not involved in this piece of research, our website offers a tool or a calculator for identifying which segment people belong to based on a set of questions, which are called the 16 golden questions. And these 16 questions were taken from a larger set of 45 questions because we found them to be the closest predictors of whether or not people belong to one of the 7 segments. And with that, back to you.
So how we did our student-facing research, we used the Totem cardholder database, which is made up of students in further and higher education, to run an online survey. We asked respondents, the students, the 16 questions, and then applied the segmentation model to identify which segment they fell into. We did that research in November 2022, and we got 1,655 responses. And just to tell you a bit more about the methodology, so we promoted the research as a survey on participants' views on issues facing society today. So we didn't mention climate change in the promotion, so we weren't kind of influencing who responded to the survey as much as we could. Previous research suggests that there isn't a significant difference between totem card holders and non-totem card holders. However, it's worth just kind of making sure that you're aware that the last kind of check on differences was before the card changed from NUS Extra to Totem. So we still kind of work on the presumption that it's reflective of the student population, but just to make you aware of that caveat. So before we get on to hearing a bit more about the findings, we've got a quick Slido poll for you. So hopefully you can all access Slido using the QR code or going to slido.com and using this access code. And it'd be great to hear from you some of the key words that you would use to describe the values and beliefs of students in relation to climate change. So if you're able to start accessing that and type in your thoughts, that'd be great to see. Great, so you can start to see some words coming in here, and I think Slido makes the ones that come up most often biggest. So yeah, clearly some kind of words relating to kind of the concern, anxiety caused by climate change amongst the student population. Other words in concerned, passionate, also indifferent, which is really interesting to see that in relation to most of the other words that we can see on screen, which suggests that kind of this population is kind of really invested in taking action on climate change. Cool, so thank you very much for suggesting those words. It's really interesting, I think, if you bear some of this in mind as we move through the next few slides, which will start to introduce you to the 7 segments and how they align with students' views. So yeah, if you can take a mental snapshot of the words on this slide and kind of bear that in mind as we work through the next set of slides. So the 16 golden questions that were asked to students through our online survey revealed this breakdown across the segments. So you can see here that the largest segment is positive activists. And this is, as you'll see in a moment, really aligned with some of the words that you were adding on screen there. However, they do make up just 37% of the sample. So as we go through, you'll find out a bit more detail about what these other segments think and feel in relation to climate change. I'm just going to hand it over to my colleague Swetha, who's going to tell you a bit more detail about each of the segments.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, as Rachel said, the first and the most common segment amongst the student population is the progressive activist segment. Progressive activists are opinionated, well-educated, tolerant, confident and passionate. They're generally quite left-wing and politically active across a wide range of issues on a global scale, and they usually engage with climate change issues on a personal and professional level. So this segment is generally quite young. As you can see from our research, we found that a third of students in this segment are between 18 to 22 years old. Over half of students in this segment are women, and 12% of them identify as people of colour or other ethnically minoritized backgrounds. So the second most common segment amongst students is the civic pragmatist segment, with 19% of students falling into this segment. Civic pragmatists are also quite left-leaning politically, but they're more moderate compared to progressive activists. They're also well-educated, tolerant, and environmental in their day-to-day lives, but they're more anxious about the future and climate change issues. There was slightly more variation in age with this segment with the students, but over 50% are still 29 years old and under. And also this is the segment where we found that there was the highest proportion of women compared to men. Then the third most common segment among the students was the loyal nationals, with 15% of students falling into this segment. They are generally quite left-leaning economically, but right-leaning socially. And the people in this segment are generally working class, quite traditional, and proud to be British, and feel threatened by issues of crime and immigration. So they believe that the UK is already living with the reality of climate change, but they see it as more of a local issue rather than a global issue. And nationally, the segment is made up of an older segment of the population, and this is sort of reflected in our data too, with 51% of students that fell into this segment being 30 to 49 years old. And also we found 15% of this segment identify as people of colour. So then we have the established liberals, who are generally conservative voters, quite financially secure, comfortable and confident. They're generally quite optimistic and feel the least threatened about the future and climate change compared to all the segments. They have a global outlook and are generally interested in sort of low carbon solutions. And amongst students, this segment has the most even split between men and women, with over a fifth being 18 to 20 years old, 22 years old, and the same amount being between 30 and 39 years old. And within the segment with the students, we had over a fifth identifying as people of colour or from an ethnically minoritized background. So then we found that 10% of students are backbone conservatives. So this group are very conservative, generally well off and proud to be British. They take pride in sort of British success stories, and they generally care about food and farming issues and the rural economy. So less than half of the students we found in the segment are full-time students. So a bit of an older group of students falling into this segment, with a quarter being aged 30 to 39 years old, and 16% identifying as people of colour. And again, quite an even split between men and women in this segment. And then the two disengaged segments were the least common amongst students. So the first one, disengaged battlers, 5% of students fall into this segment. It's typically quite a young and urban segment that are financially insecure. They generally feel unheard and unrepresented. And they're generally sort of unconvinced that action needs to be taken on climate change issues. But they don't really see how they're going to benefit from that action. And the two disengaged segments are the ones where there are more men than women proportionally, at least among the students. Also, it's a fairly young segment. We found that 37% of the students are 18 to 22 years old. And this segment was also the segment that had the smallest amount of people of colour or from ethnically minoritized backgrounds, with only 7%. And then the last segment, disengaged traditionalists, are generally male, traditional, disillusioned, working class, and they feel quite alienated. They don't really believe in the need for climate action. And again, there are more men than women in this segment amongst the students, with 54% identifying as men. And within this segment, we had the highest proportion of people that identify as colour, with 28% identifying as people of colour or from other ethnically minoritized backgrounds. So lastly, Here you can see the differences between our survey findings with the students and the research that was carried out with the general public in 2020. So the blue bars are the student survey results and the pink, the general public results. So as you can see, the data from the UK public is far more spread between all 7 segments, with the most common being disengaged traditionalists at 18%, whilst this was the least common segment amongst students. And then with the progressive activists, this was the most common amongst students, with 37% falling into this segment, but it was one of the smallest amongst the UK public. So this could be because a certain type of student is maybe more likely to respond to the survey. But as Victor said, we're still sort of operating on the basis that the student sample is representative of the student population. But the difference between the national survey data and student data is quite large, as you can see. So yeah, that's kind of a summary of the key findings of the research that we conducted. So next, Louisa from Climate Outreach will take you through a little bit more on the sort of insights from the research.
Great, thank you so much, Threila. Yes, so what does this all mean for how we engage students who, as we've seen, reach right across all of the 7 segments? Does that mean that we need a separate targeted engagement strategy for all of them? Luckily, the good news is that no, you don't, but there are important complexities and nuances to be aware of. And I will highlight a few sort of key top-level ones here in the next few minutes. So one fundamental thing to know and be aware of is that you're not starting from zero when it comes to raising climate issue salience, because all of the 7 segments are, to an extent, already worried about climate change, as you can see here. And next slide. That they believe that climate change is real and the result of human action. And as I've seen sort of from the Slido, things you submitted just now, I know that many of you here are already aware of this, but the reason this is important to keep in mind when it comes to engagement is that whenever we try to engage individuals or a group on climate issues, we need to be aware of the fact that they're more likely than not to already care about climate change. And the way we engage and the language we use really needs to reflect that. And I think this is particularly important as, you know, the movement has often used quite moralizing or even paternalistic language when this is not really where, you know, the people we're talking to are coming from or starting at. Next slide, please. At the same time, there are some important differences to be aware of between the 7 segments, some of which you can see listed here. So, for example, established liberals tend to be much more optimistic in their outlook on the future, and relatedly, the ability of technology and society to overcome challenges posed by the climate crisis. Further, while trust in elites is generally very low in British society, this is particularly true for segments like the disengaged battlers or the loyal nationals. And this perceived hypocrisy they feel towards people in positions of power is an important thing that we need to keep in mind when it comes to the people we choose to quote in our campaigns or the partners that we choose. There are also large differences in whether it's better to localize climate issues and make them relevant to immediate contexts, like it is for loyal nationals, and when it might be better and more effective to bring in the global perspective and lean on values such as solidarity, for example, with people who already feel the devastating effects of climate change in their everyday lives. So this approach, the latter, is more effective for progressive activists and civic pragmatists, for example. And then finally, another key dividing line is the extent to which the different segments trust environmental campaigners and whether they think people like them are trustworthy spokespeople on climate. And I think here it's very important to be aware of the fact that apart from progressive activists, many distrust campaigners, but instead they're more likely to listen to health professionals, to farmers, or even members from their local wildlife organizations on climate. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what does this mean in terms of what we want to be thinking about when engaging the different segments? For progressive activists, it's really important that our campaigns continue to build efficacy and optimism. As Swetha said, this is the most passionate segment, but that also means that climate anxiety and disillusionment about the really slow pace of political and societal progress made thus far is particularly high among the segment. And so that's why we need to engage progressive activists in a way that shows that their actions still matter. And we can do this by pointing to success stories and really highlighting the achievements that have already been made to foster a sense of hope and sustain it to keep climate action going. For civic pragmatists, it is equally as important that our campaigns engage them in ways that are meaningful to them and give them a sense of making a difference. But as we heard before, the segment is particularly cautious in the way it engages with the outside world and has more anxiety. And so our calls to action need to be reasonable and quite sort of focused on actions that can legitimately be taken and are not too overwhelming, but slowly and steadily build confidence that climate action is possible and can progressively grow. For established liberals who tend to be more confident and optimistic and have a high trust in new technologies, it's key to portray lifestyle changes as common sense, making climate conscious choices more attractive and sort of supporting them in a self-determined lifestyle decisions and making pro-climate action seem aspirational. For loyal nationals, who are one of the most concerned segments about climate change, but their main concern is their immediate surrounding and issues they face every day, such as the cost of living crisis or degradation of local green spaces. And for them, it's important to localize the issue of climate change and invoke and restore a sense of pride in kind of Britain's traditional countryside heritage and protection of local species. For backbone conservatives, they require quite a pragmatic approach to engagement. And this segment generally sees other issues such as the economy as more important than climate. But we can engage them through sort of linking certain issues that they care about. And it's important that we frame climate solutions as kind of the right, no-nonsense thing to do. And then for the final two disengaged segments, the disengaged traditionalists and disengaged battlers, really the lack of trust in institutions of any kind is really the largest barrier to climate engagement with them. And one way to tackle this might be to focus on really tangible co-benefits of climate action in the here and now. So, like low traffic neighborhoods and air pollution, which is something that can be seen more or less right away rather than positive outcomes that only materialize 10 or 30 years down the line. And another key element for these two disengaged segments is a focus on fairness. So again, showing tangible ways in which climate solutions can restore a sense of recognition and equity, rather than being this kind of middle-class project that has no space for them. And next slide, please. Yeah, so finally, I just wanted to end by pointing to a few key narratives and frames that we at Climate Outreach have tested over the years and which have shown potential to unify across the 7 segments. The first one is kind of a nature narrative or frame, and it reflects the main way in which people really think about and relate to climate change, which is kind of a fear or worry about loss of biodiversity, of green spaces, and of wildlife. And what's been really promising there is kind of this framing of restoring a natural and healthy balance between humans and nature. So framing climate action in those terms. And then a second frame, which relates to this, is health and well-being. We've seen real potential in framing climate action as having the ability to improve health, especially in cities, but also well-being more generally. And this also responds to one of the few things that people can actually name when they think about the risks of the effects of climate change. There's still a lot of lack of awareness of all the elements of life that climate change will actually impact, but health getting worse is one of the few things that most people think of when they think about the effects of climate change. And then thirdly, the Britain getting on with it narrative is related to this no-nonsense framing that I mentioned earlier in relation to background conservatives. And so almost all the segments are disillusioned with the slow pace of change and lack of government action. And so framing decisive action now as kind of a reasonable next step and delivering on promises that were already made, say in the Paris Agreement or at COP26, is a better way to show that like Britain is getting on with it and getting it done, rather than framing climate action as kind of this radical redirection and a complete overhaul of our entire way of life. And then finally, the shared connection narrative, which relates to ideas of the good life. And it frames climate action as a more natural and intuitive way of relating to the world and those around us. Especially after COVID, this kind of more holistic framing of coexistence has real potential to effectively engage different segments. And it plays to the idea of like a slower, more conscious life that allows stronger connection with the food we eat, knowing, you know, where the food on our plate actually comes from, the roads and the way we travel, and how we engage with the communities around us and shape their decision making. Great, so back to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Louisa. As for the last 15 or so minutes, we will look at how what we talked about and heard about this afternoon relate to the work that we do here at SOS-UK and kind of what you do with your students. But next slide, please. So we're going to do another quick Slido to kind of find out from your end about which segment do you think you're engaging most successfully in your work. So if you have the Slido loaded up on your phone, I think this poll should just appear there, or there's a barcode you can click on. Sorry, scan. Let's give it a couple more seconds. We can see so far, by far, we are engaging progressive activists the most, which, you know, in a way is a good thing because it's our biggest segment. As we saw, is that 37% of the student population is progressive activists. However, it is really important to kind of fully engage the spectrum of segments if we want to create real change around sustainability. And I guess 37% is the highest, but that leaves us with another 63% that aren't part of the segment. So we kind of need to try and engage them. Final shout out for Eddie. Perfect. Great. Thanks, Rachel. Well, at SOS-UK, we have been trying to engage students across a whole range of programs, projects and campaigns for the last 4 years that we've been SOS-UK, and then for another decade when we're part of the NU sustainability team. So we have a lot of experience in this, and the work that we do has been spanning sustainability across the whole range from waste and energy to ethical finance and biodiversity. Kind of came up, Louisa mentioned, is actually a unifying thing, thinking about nature. So our approach for the last few years has been about having multiple entry points for students to engage with our work, which is kind of ranged from individual behavior change, which might be actions that students can take in their homes of residence, such as washing clothes at 30 degrees or recycling their waste, to lobbying politicians for curriculum reform and systemic change that we do through our education work around our Teach Them future campaign. However, within each specific program or campaign, we also tend to have multiple opportunities for students depending on level of interest, which can range from volunteering across the whole year or taking part in a quick online competition. So what this research means for us is that, despite working within this area for well over a decade, we can be more strategic in our messaging, and we're kind of trying to be, but I think this will help pinpoint what the areas are. So my colleague Emma will now give you a couple of specific examples of how we start to think about this through the work that we do with our students. So I'm going to hand over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Joanna. So I just picked out a couple of examples that I can talk through that might also help sort of show how you could use this research in your work as well. So starting off with the progressive activists, I already saw someone in the Q&A ask about this being maybe the most obvious group to engage. And I think, we have done a lot of work with progressive activists at SOS-UK. And one of the campaigns we work especially with progressive activists on would be the Invest for Change campaign. So I've just put a couple of bullet points there at the top of the screen. You can see that I've taken from the Climate Outreach website in terms of the best ways to engage progressive activists. So talking about climate justice is really important, acknowledging pessimism but avoiding fatalism or that anxiety that was brought up earlier in the webinar, and also finding a way to channel their antagonism into some form of climate action. So with Invest for Change, even the name itself is quite positive sounding, and it also has that double meaning of sort of investing their money, but also investing in the future as well, and change being a really positive thing as well. So the text on the bottom left-hand side of the screen is actually taken directly from the Invest for Change website. And the first part sort of outlines the issue of how universities are investing possibly against the interests of students in terms of in fossil fuels and that sort of thing. And then the green text below it explains how the Invest for Change campaign is working to change that through sort of really positive methods. It highlights young people, frontline communities and the planet. So again, really linking to climate justice there and channeling their sort of the anger that might come up from that initial statistic into action. And we've got a tweet on the right-hand side, which is a fairly recent one around how it was announced that leading universities are urging investment managers to halt support of fossil fuel expansion, and linking that to the Invest for Change work and how students can get involved in that. And so this is the sort of work that really only progressive activists would be engaged in, because it's quite high level and it asks quite a lot in terms of investment in the ideas and time as well, to be honest, in terms of getting involved in this campaign. So this is an example of one that is really for progressive activists that we offer at SOS-UK. And I'll now talk through another part of our work that is more in terms of more broad reaching, and I've specifically looked at engaging civic pragmatists, low nationalists and established liberals, which were the top three outside of the progressive activist category. So with this one, I sort of chose the example of our student switch off campaign, which has been running for 15 years now. And that is something that, it really engages students on a wide range of levels, from entering small level competitions and quizzes all the way up to sort of volunteering. So there are aspects of it in terms of the progressive activists could be involved in volunteering, but it's much more broad reaching. And again, I've taken from the bullet points from the Climate Outreach website in terms of how to really engage this sort of broad audience. So looking at building confidence as advocates for their community. So we do this by offering really simple infographics and providing all the information in really digestible pieces, holding their attention. So we do, like I say, quizzes and competitions that are really engaging throughout the year, as well as sort of in-person stalls as well. Emphasizing rational economics of actions is really important as well. So making it sort of is common sense to sort of make sure to save energy, especially linking to the cost of living crisis. That's we found is really effective over the past year, especially. That's really on students' minds at the moment. Also looking at authentically positive and forward-looking stories is really important. So yeah, not just focusing on the negatives, but also what you can do. So that's why we have sort of a pledge every year, so students can pledge what they're going to do to be more sustainable. So looking at the positives, not just the negatives. Also looking at bringing things closer to home and making it local. So again, this particular campaign is focused on what students can do in their homes and in their local community. So that kind of automatically ticks that box. And then also calling out big polluters who must play by the rules. So that's something that we're possibly looking to do more of in the coming years, because I think that would really link in with this campaign really well. And so we have this tagline with this particular campaign, which is Learn, Act, Lead, which is kind of the journey that we're sort of hoping to help support students along over the course of the year in terms of all the different activities they can take part in. And this would appeal to, as I say, the civic pragmatists, loyal nationalists and established liberals the most. So yeah, that's just a few examples that might help think about applying that in reality. Thanks, back to you.
Great, thanks, Emma. So yeah, now it's time for questions. So I'll just open the Q&A box and see if we can answer any of your questions. So the first question is around the high proportion of students considering themselves learning disabled. So actually in the presentation, we just presented the figures for people who identified as disabled in any way. So I wouldn't know specifically that they are identifying as learning disabled. It included learning disabilities, but also physically disabled and kind of other long-term health issues as well. So yeah, that figure encompassed the full range of identities within that category. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. There's a question from Megan, who says that they're teaching in further education and the picture is very different with their students. I don't know if you're able to share anything, any of your reflections on kind of what was different in your experience to the presentation of our findings. If you're happy to, I think I can let you speak if that's easier, or alternatively, I think you can type in the chat box. I don't know if you can see the chat box.
I can also see, Rachel, there was a follow-up question from Megan about are we doing research with FE students 16-19? Do we have any plans for that?
So this research does actually incorporate FE students. So the totem cardholder database that we access via NUS incorporates both higher education and further education students. Sorry, I've just seen your response that you're happy to speak. Yeah, I will do that after I finish answering. We have got in the full research report a breakdown of the proportion of our sample that is in higher education versus further education. I can't actually get to that right now because I'm sharing my screen, so we can follow up with you directly after the call, or yeah, we've got some links in a minute just to share with you, so you'll be able to see that yourself. Let me just find you and I will. So you should be able to talk now, Megan, if you're able to share any reflections on your experience as to what you found different.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, okay. So the students that I teach are 16 to 19, predominantly from quite low income backgrounds. And with the lessons that I've done, a lot of them have fairly low knowledge about climate change, and there's a lot who are reading sort of disinformation, like conspiracy theories and things like that. So yeah, it does seem to be quite different from the progressive activist group that you're talking about. But I think some of the stuff around what was the second group, the established liberals, loyal nationalists and civic pragmatists might be more relevant. But yeah, I mean, it would just be really interesting to know about any specific research just looking at FE and the backgrounds that some of the kids are coming from as well.
Great, yeah. I think what we can do as a follow-up to that is look at the breakdown of FE versus HE in this sample and see if we can produce independent reports. So in the report that we've, I'll share with you the link for, we've grouped all the two different levels together. But yeah, recognizing that there are likely to be different backgrounds potentially within FE to HE, and that potentially has an influence on the segment that they fall into. Yeah, we can look in to see whether we can produce like this specific reports for each of the two different sectors as well. So yeah, that's really interesting to hear your feedback on that. Thank you. I'm just going to work through some of the questions. So Claire says that she supposes that progressive activists are the ones who can and will engage the others. Louisa, I don't know if you, in the kind of delving into the different segments, that was something that you looked into, the extent to which particular segments might be more able to kind of share the message with their peers or other groups?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just briefly. So I think segments which are more similar to each other have the potential to sort of influence each other. So I think if you're looking for progressive activists to engage, say, civic pragmatists to sort of take that extra step of taking a certain political action that civic pragmatists might not naturally wouldn't naturally do, I think there is potential. Otherwise, I think we need to keep in mind that there's almost a danger, you know, in saying that if a disengaged battler sees a progressive activist taking certain action, they're going to think, I would never do that. Like this, it's almost like off-putting because their identity is so different from this person that a disengaged battler needs a spokesperson from someone, from a group that they already trust. So I don't know, this could be from their local sports club, from their band that they play in or something. And that's going to be a lot more effective in trying to engage them rather than putting this very different person on a pedestal and saying, oh, you should be like this kind of thing.
Thank you very much, Louisa. So Louise reflects that she works at university and the students seem very disengaged with little positive action on climate change. And I guess potentially then those students might fall into segments outside of the positive activists. But just to support your work in engaging students, I guess one thing that you could do potentially is run your own segmentation research with the students on your campus. So all of Climate Outreach's the questions are kind of publicly available and published on the website. So we just borrowed them for our research that we did with the Totem database, but I think they're all publicly available. So maybe doing some kind of more bespoke research at your university would help understand kind of the breakdown of students that you're directly working with. So Jessica says, does this incorporate international students? And if not, what do you think the results might look like when applied to students from other countries? So yeah, international students are included if they had a Totem card. And again, in the report, there's a breakdown of the makeup of the students according to whether they're UK based and domestic students or whether they're from within the EU or beyond the EU. I'm not sure about the applicability to the model in other countries because my understanding is that it's quite specific to political cultures in the UK, but I don't know, Louisa, you might be able to add something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it leans on a lot of values and worldviews that people kind of pick up as they grow up in the UK. So I think you can be a foreign national and still hold a lot of these values, but it is kind of tailored to the experience of having lived in the UK for a long time through one's formative years. So for example, I work in Germany. We have a Germany Talks Climate that uses the segmentation in Germany. And for example, there are 6 segments as opposed to 7, and they all differ slightly. So I think, yeah, we should be cautious when we try to apply the segments directly as they are, but there are certainly still, you know, beliefs and values that apply across cultures as well.
I'm just aware that we're at the time that we have allocated, but there's a lot of more questions to answer. So I'm just checking with all the presenters that they're happy to stay on for a bit longer and work through the questions. Cool. I can see Louisa nodding. I can't see anyone else, but I can see Emma nodding. Cool. So the next question is, in terms of putting out consistent messaging to engage students on climate issues, how do you manage the difficulty that comes with the different portions of the student population having very different values and perspectives on this? So I guess Joanna and Emma, maybe you can offer some insights from our work, and then if there's anything to add, Louisa, that'd be great.
I can take this. Start off anyway. Yeah, I think this is a real challenge. It's definitely something that because we do such a variety of projects and campaigns at SOS-UK, yeah, it is a challenge. And I think one thing that we're trying to work on is sort of having that consistency, like you say, about using the caption function, for example, when you're posting on Instagram, to sort of have the main sort of chunk and bulk of what you're talking about. Say it's about student switch off, and it's about yeah, having sort of saving energy in the home, and then having something aligned, just a simple line about how that connects to the wider picture. So maybe something about how many the proportion of carbon emissions that come from home energy use, for example, and why it's important to link to climate justice. So it's not the main message, but it's sort of consistent in there, so that if you do have a student who sort of stumbles upon it, who may be in the progressive activist sort of segment and may see, oh, that's a bit basic, they can then see that and understand how it links in. But I do understand that it is really difficult sometimes to do that. Yeah, I don't know if Joanna or Louisa, you want to jump in with any other sort of tips or ideas about how we can do that?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So yeah, kind of thinking to our student switch off campaign, that's, I would say, probably our biggest campaign. We kind of work with just under 100,000 students on it, and kind of halls of residence across the UK, and what we consider above a broad brush campaign. As part of it, there are loads of different points that students kind of can enter, like Emma mentioned, through like a simple competition, or for students who are much more engaged, can come to our training where we have where we train students around this sort of issue of the whole system kind of thinking, as they say in your message, Felicity, versus individual action, because I know that there's tension between this. Some people say, well, we should not be concentrating on individual action, it should be about systems change, but our approaches that are actually two different sides of the same coin. So we kind of feel like we do need kind of individual action because they kind of feed into each other. So I guess we kind of touch on that, and we then would hope then those students who are the more engaged ones would then do peer-to-peer engagement. That's the sort of kind of approach that we take, and talk about different co-benefits, like Emma said and Louisa said, because the same message won't ring home. So it's not an easy task, and we're still kind of learning through the research that we have what works, what doesn't. And actually, we kind of feel like we actually need to adapt on an ongoing basis, because things that we used to do 5 years ago just don't resonate with students anymore, or the sort of platforms that we used to use, like Facebook, we use that anymore. We kind of disregarded that years ago. So we kind of need to be kind of kept on our toes, and kind of through this sort of research kind of helps us kind of target different student groups. But we don't have a perfect solution. It's still learning in progress, but we basically try and put different options out there, and we always have engagement on certain different levels, but it's a more in-depth one, let's say through student switch off, which is the one of the three that Emma mentioned. The most engaged one definitely has the least number of students engaged compared to the kind of shallow level of engagement, or shallow, by that I mean the kind of easy entry points where we might just need one engagement that they might do like climate quiz, or tip out in a quick simple competition, and kind of can help hook students in. And we're never going to engage everyone. I think we've kind of come to realize that, but as long as we can engage vast segments, it's a kind of starting point, and we're hoping it's going to go past the tipping point. Rachel, I'm going to hand over back to you.
Cool, thank you. I'm just trying to work through some of the questions to see if there's any commonalities. But one of the questions related to progressive activists as a group, and as a question around how active are progressive activists. And I guess that kind of comes back to a discussion we were actually having internally when putting this presentation together and thinking about within our team at SOS-UK. I think pretty much every member of the team came out as progressive activists, but we have quite a spectrum within the team in terms of the actions that we individually take on climate change, obviously, and we're all working on these issues, so that's one thing, but in our personal lives, the things we choose to do are quite different. So yeah, I don't know, Louisa, if the research kind of brought any kind of findings in relation to kind of the range of different activities. I guess it's more focused on people's kind of underlying values and beliefs rather than thinking specifically about the actions they might take.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. So we don't have like a barometer that measures every 6 months which actions people take. I would say that it's important to remember that this is a values-based segmentation and not a demographic one. So that means that people of all kinds of incomes are going to be progressive activists. You know, they tend to be not from the lowest income households, but you know, there's a range of people in this segment. And so just because their ideas about how the world works and what are the main issues of our time are, just because those align doesn't mean that they all have the same ability and are in the same position to actually take certain action. So maybe just as an aside.
Cool, thank you. So there's a question around the best way to engage with students. Is it online, social media, email, or face-to-face? And I think, Joanna, you were going to answer that one.
Yeah, I can pick on that, and then Emma, if you have anything else to add. I mean, we do a whole host of different ways of engaging students. We kind of think that putting stuff on social media can almost plant the seed. And then when we kind of camp on campus, it almost does give us a bit of a hook to kind of chat to students. So it's not the first time that they've heard of it. We do find that face-to-face engagement actually can be really important because there's so much stuff going on in social media right now. You can be almost overwhelmed. So our face-to-face kind of stalls that Emma mentioned can be really quite impactful. We find training is an interesting one. Since COVID, we've kind of played around with doing some training online, some training face-to-face, and actually for training, well, some sorts of training, actually online has been better because it is more inclusive. You don't need to kind of leave your room. You can come to like this webinar. You don't need to travel across a town or across even campus to kind of come along. So for some things, actually, we were a little bit surprised that when we kind of ran both a webinar option and face-to-face, we actually had more on webinar. But for some certain training that actually involves being around for the whole day, actually that's better face-to-face. So we're kind of using a mix. We don't tend to do everything online ever. We kind of do need that face-to-face interaction, and it can be really quite beneficial. I don't know, Emma, do you have any reflection from, because you have actually been going on campus and talking to students face-to-face?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've changed a lot in our approach. Obviously with COVID, it kind of went completely online for a couple of years or a year and a half or so. And sort of we're just sort of coming back out into that hybrid phase now. And I think students are now expecting there to be a bit of a hybridity to any sort of engagement activity. So there's definitely, I think, a benefit to having that face-to-face. I think that's really invaluable. But having the option to have lots of it online as well is really, really important. So having that mix, I think, is really, really key. And also just meeting students where they're at. So there's, like Jenna recently said, there's no point really posting on Facebook because students aren't on Facebook at the moment. But for example, we work with some universities who have their own apps, and that can be really good because students are already using the apps for various other things. And so if you can sort of use that to engage them on that platform, they're more likely to engage than they would maybe follow us intentionally on Instagram or another platform. So yeah, it's about sort of finding where students are already and trying to get into those spaces as much as possible.
Great. I think we'll have just one more question, and then we'll close the session. So there's a question around international students again, and those in student halls in the UK. And there's a question from Olga who asks, what would you suggest is the best way to engage students who might not necessarily feel connected to the local area and therefore are not interested in improving their immediate surroundings? So again, it's kind of, again, reflecting on the point that we made earlier around how the segmentation model is built on kind of British values and experiences, but I guess there's definitely lessons that we can learn from those and apply them to people with different perspectives and backgrounds. Emma, I think you wanted to answer this one?
Yeah, I can start coming in on this. So with our student switch-off program that we run, we actually find that a lot of international students, a high proportion of international students do engage really well with the program in terms of volunteering as sort of leaders in the program, but also engaging in the quizzes and competitions. And I think this is partially because with the volunteering side of things, we often frame it as a way to gain skills and as a sort of employability aspect to it. And so that can really help to bring in a diversity of students who might not naturally be inclined to engage in sustainability sort of activities, and maybe aren't the activists as well. So yeah, that could be one way of sort of framing it in terms of skill development. And then, yeah, as I say, we also just find that students are more interested in finding out maybe about what we do in the UK, so finding out how the energy UK system works in the UK in terms of energy systems and that sort of thing. So I think framing it in a slightly different way has worked really well for us with Student Switcher.
And I was going to add to that, sorry Rachel, no, you're going to try to shut this down. The final thing I was going to say, in terms of engagement with halls, it's actually something that, you know, we've been doing this for about 15 years, and we kind of look at, you know, habits discontinuity kind of hypothesis and moments of change, and actually we kind of trying to get in there from day one, because I think once you kind of try to normalize habits from then it does become easier. I mean, I always think of myself as an example, like terrible/good example. Like I grew up in a country where there was no recycling. It was completely unsustainable. I moved over to the UK. I had recycling bins. Everybody cycled everywhere on their bikes. And actually that really rang home to me that I should be doing this. That's what's normal in this country. So I should be doing this. I kind of started acting more sustainably. And I think there's a lot to be said about kind of normalizing behaviors, because, you know, we all at the end of the day want to fit into our surroundings. So even if you're not from the country that you go to your university, you will kind of do what your peers do, and that's actually really quite powerful. So I think kind of trying to embed certain norms, especially in halls from day one, can actually be quite powerful.
Cool, thanks, Joanna. So yeah, as Joanna predicted, I think we should probably come to a close now. We've overrun by 15 minutes, but thank you very much for all your questions. And just to finish, for those of you who have managed to last this long, here are all the links to access the various different things that we've touched on. So you can access the research report on the SOS website at this address and find out more about our project and programs, how your institution can be part of those at the link there. All of the resources from Climate Outreach are also available, so as well as the segmentation questions that we used. We simply downloaded them and got going with the research, so they're always available for others to do the same, and there's a whole lot of other information about the segments in a lot more detail than we've touched on today, so I definitely encourage you to have a look at that. And if your interest has been piqued, you can also find out what segment you fall into using the follow link. So thanks again for joining the webinar. If you have any follow-up questions that you want to get in touch with any of the presenters about, you can find them at these two email addresses. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.